You're listening to Transforming Life Sciences, the Medidata podcast series, which explores how technology can accelerate the healthcare revolution. During this podcast, Christian and Jeremy Sohn, VP and Global Head of Digital Business Development and Licensing at Novartis, will discuss what it takes to be truly patient-centric today, where the industry is still falling short, and what key changes are needed to make sure that this isn't just another buzzword. So very warm welcome to both you, Jeremy and Christian.
Thank you very much
for being with us today.
Pleased to be here.
Jeremy and Christian, what does patient centricity mean to you? Jeremy, why don't you kick us off?
Patient centricity, many years ago, we used to refer to clinical trial participants as subjects. And we treated them as subjects, although not intentionally. And it was a one-directional relationship. They were participating in the clinical trial, but they were objects for observation for our studies. Over the last couple of years, I think the pharmaceutical industry, the community has recognized the importance that while it's very important to advance the science, it's important to realize that the participant is contributing a tremendous amount to the process. They're giving of themselves. And so the idea of a participant means that there's a dual relationship. There's a duality that's extraordinarily important. And so for us, patient centricity is recognizing the fact that we really have to engage that individual in a meaningful way. We have to understand where he or she is coming from, and we need to think about their needs in as much as, and at the same time as we're thinking about our interests in terms of advancing science and bringing to that patient, to that participant, the best in class drugs that we can.
Patient centricity for me means that we are putting the patient into the center of every trial. And there are reasons for this, because we are impacting patients in various ways. So patients are going through a very intense time of their life. We are having patients who are impacted by cancer, or their families are impacted by cancer. These patients are going through a very special time during their lifetime. And what we would like to avoid is that the patient is losing the engagement to the trial, both in the positive and in the negative ways. And because what we are seeing is really patients are starting to lose interest, patients are starting to think and actually doing it to drop out of a clinical trial. We see trials where we are having dropout rates of more than 30%. And at the end of the day, this data is gone. So if a patient is dropping out before the end of a trial, the data that has been captured so far is actually useless. Yeah? And this is definitely something that we would like to avoid, because the more high quality data we are jointly generating, the more successful we will be during a clinical trial.
So why is patient centricity such an important topic today, Jeremy?
Coming back again, I think we have a moral obligation to patients to make sure that we're thinking about their needs and their interests at the same time as we're thinking about the objectives of our clinical studies. But you point out really important facts, which is that there's a secondary effect. There's a benefit that if we do focus on patient centricity, if we focus on the needs of the patients, we too can benefit from that in the context of retention, in the context of adherence, in the context of getting better quality data, because those patients will be doing the things that we need them to do in order to ensure the statistical validity of the study. And so there's this duality. And so what I don't want to suggest is that patient centricity is really about our needs, right? To make sure that we're hitting our study objectives. But it's a phenomenal secondary benefit. So if we're doing what we should be doing in terms of thinking about the design of the study, reducing patient burden, understanding how the disease is reflected from the patient's perspective, the patient voice, I think we all win. And so that's the beauty of this, of focusing on patient centricity. Yeah. If you look at statistically at the numbers, we lose somewhere between 30 and 40% of our patients to attrition in a clinical trial. When you look at adherence, whether it's adherence to the protocol, showing up for clinical visits when they need to, answering a particular survey when they need to, taking the medication when he or she needs to. Adherence is again somewhere in the, or the lack of adherence is again in the 30 to 40%. Every 10% reduction in either retention in the study, compliance to the protocol, leads to a doubling, if not tripling, in the size of that study. And so a study that could potentially be done with 100 patients ends up needing to be statistically sized at 500, even 1,000 patients. And so what that means is not that we're afraid of those numbers, because we have to sort of accept the real world experiences of patients. But what that means is that these are larger studies, which means that they're longer studies, which means they're more expensive studies, which means that it takes longer for us to potentially bring these important drugs to market. And it also increases the risk of having noise in our data. And what we really want to do is hone in on making sure that we understand the efficacy and the safety of these drugs, and just that. And so patient centricity allows us to hopefully address those important issues.
And I like your comment that it starts early, and it's actually starting, when you're designing the protocol of the trial. And you might think that when you are starting the trial, you can handle everything with technology and with Medidata solutions, obviously. But it's starting quite early, and it's starting early when you're setting up the protocol. It's even starting earlier when you're looping in data from the real world, like you guys are doing right now, and to really look early enough into what's actually targeted to be achieved at the end of the trial. That's great what you're doing.
So you both talked about how patient centricity is both good for the patient, but it's also good for life sciences. But it appears there remains some reluctance to change still. Why do you think that is?
I think when you take a look at the amount of change, it is an enormous amount of change on all sides and all stakeholders who are impacted and who are actually working within clinical research. So from a global pharma sponsor side, from a biotech side, on the regulator side, I think the willingness is definitely there. It just takes time in order to turn large organizations and large regulators around in order to be more patient-centric. I think there is a huge willingness there on the patient side, there's a huge willingness there on the regulator and on the sponsor side. It just needs to be done. There are certain ways to accelerate this. We are a part of this. We're helping clients in order to be more patient-centric. We're helping them to enroll patients faster. We are helping them to loop in patients' technologies. So every patient most likely will have a smartphone. Every patient will have a smartwatch. We are now seeing that Apple is launching the first FDA-approved smartwatch, which is really able to loop in data from the real world, and that has been captured in real time. I think there are certain ways how to accelerate this. It just takes time, but we see, huge milestone and huge quantum leaps in the near future, and I'm very excited about this already.
So I'm super enthusiastic with the strides that we've made. I think the fact that we're actually even talking about patient centricity in the last couple of years is an indication that there's a willingness to engage. In fact, even yesterday I heard that the chief patient officer is sort of the new in vogue hire for big pharma. I think where I'm a little bit skeptical is that, are those individuals, are those teams actually being properly funded to achieve their objective? To come back to the question around what are some of the challenges? Why isn't it happening faster? I think you point out correctly that there are technical challenges, there are process challenges, there are regulatory challenges. The work that's been done over the last couple of years has been some of the low-hanging fruit. So trial design, study design. We can look at how a study is being designed, and we could say, well, really, do I need the patient to come in every other week or once a month? Is it possible for them to just come into the site every other month? Can we get rid of 50% of the visits? In fairness, it's hard because these studies are becoming more and more complex, and we're actually trying to understand diseases in more ways than we've ever understood them before, which means oftentimes you actually need more visits. You need to take more tests. And so we're trying to find that balance. Aside from clinical trial design, you nicely mentioned that we're looking at technology. Technology is an amazing way, right, to engage patients, to engage consumers. And in many cases, it could be passive. So we don't have to ask a person to answer X, Y, and Z, or oftentimes even to go into a clinic to take a blood pressure. Or if we're going to take blood, we could actually send a visiting nurse to the person's home and do some of that locally. But at the same time, introducing technology into these processes introduces different challenges. Does that technology work consistently in every geography in which we're running the clinical trial? As simple things, and this is an example when I first got into the industry that may be considered an abstruse concept, but we were testing out a blood pressure cuff, and timestamping data collection is extraordinarily important. The blood pressure cuff was shipped with the timestamp in Dallas, and we were doing the test in London. And so the timestamp came in a Dallas time, even though it was taken in London. And so when we were looking at the validity of the data, it was completely confusing. And so, and the last thing, and this sounds, again, very simple and maybe insignificant, but it's a huge issue, because if a regulator is looking at the data and they have the same question that we had, it could completely disrupt and derail or delay the use of that data in a clinical trial. And so sometimes the easiest things are not necessarily that easy.
But I think it's a team play, and I agree that there are always certain ways, to accelerate processes through technology. We, for instance, we are currently running the largest virtual trial with more than 15,000 patients enrolled who are actually don't need to visit the clinic all the time. So they're actually sitting at home. This is obviously something that you cannot do in all therapeutic areas. When you're working in oncology, you need to see the patient, but when you're doing the easy stuff, that's definitely something where you should start thinking about, whether you need to have the patient in the hospital all the time. Can some certain measurements can be done at home? Can you improve things like the 6-minute walk test, which is something that the industry is doing since centuries, I think, and there are certain ways to get some more data quality in this in order to do some longer measurements rather than 6 minutes, let them walk on the hospital floor and then do the measurements afterwards. I think there are certain areas, to improve this. And again, we're on a good way to there, but it's, again, it's a huge amount of change which is happening right now.
So practically, what can be done to accelerate this process, to make it easier for the industry to become more patient-centric?
So I think there are a couple of things that we can do. First and foremost, we talked about this already, which is we could start with trial design. Trial design is a great area for us to from the outset think about patient burden. Where can we minimize the number of touch points? Where can we minimize the direct interactions with patients? Can we move something from being active to passive, et cetera? I think the idea around sharing information. So, in fact, I started a company 6 years ago that was focused specifically on patient centricity. It was a mobile app, and the vision around the mobile app in a clinical trial was very simple. It said, if we can do nothing but provide engagement opportunities, information, what does it mean to participate in a clinical trial? Can I give you more information about your particular disease? Can I connect you to a community in a safe and protected way that doesn't impact the study design? But can I make you feel like you're not alone in this journey that you're having, right? Can I provide simple information of why is the study designed the way it's designed? Patient centricity is about, again, that duality, that recognition that in the same way that I'm taking information, I'm asking, or you're volunteering to give me information, I'm also volunteering to give you information. And so it's the second thing, and I think a very simple thing is us to think about, are there modalities where we can give the patient back some information? Can we make it reciprocal?
When I see how we informed and asked for consent of the patient in former years by giving him 80 pages of descriptions of what needs to be happening over the next couple of months and years. This is not very patient-centric, to be honest. And there are certain ways to accelerate this and to make this easier, to make use of electronic e-consent solutions. You can make use of an iPad. You can have videos, by describing the entire process. Just think about clinical trials with kids. Kids don't want to read 80 pages, neither want to do this their patients. I think there are certain ways to make it easier, and this will obviously also generate a much better patient engagement, and at the end of the day will avoid the patient dropout that we all want to avoid.
That's an area that's, to me, so obvious, right? The way informed consent today is managed is it's a stack of 10, 15, 20, 30 pages worth of content. And although we do our best to make sure that it's accessible to all patients of all educational backgrounds and ethnicities, we recognize in other parts of our lives that people learn different ways. People learn visually, people learn audibly, people learn with images, with videos. And electronic informed consent allows us to use all those modalities. The last thing actually I would say is say thank you. At the end of every study and periodically during the study, just say thank you and ask, how are we doing? When you walk into a store, there's the greeter, and there's a person says, hello, how are you, how's your day? And there's a person when you walk out, they say, thank you for coming, thank you for shopping, whether you bought something or not. We need to take that consumer orientation and bring that to our clinical trials. It's a huge difference.
You've both talked about trial design, the use of technology, partnerships, saying thank you as solutions to some of these challenges around patient centricity. But Jeremy, in your opinion, who should be responsible for driving patient centricity across the industry, but as well as within your own organisation?
I think we all have a responsibility for patient centricity. I think, as I mentioned, there are increasingly individuals who are the patient advocate, the patient centricity officer. And that's important to make sure that there's someone sort of overseeing all the various aspects, but we need to take patient centricity into everything we do, from protocol design to how we operate, to our regulatory groups are advocating for some of these changes. I'd hate to sort of put it in any one place because it needs to be a core value.
I think there are groups and organizations who can actually help us in order to become more patient-centric. There are patient organizations who are really providing an enormous amount of value to all players within the life science industry, and we are working more and more with these organizations, listen to them, so what do they actually need in order to be more engaged. But I would agree that it's part of every stakeholder from the regulatory standpoint, from a pharma standpoint, for biotech companies, even companies like Medidata who are doing technology and data and analytics work for clients like Novartis. They're responsible to make this part of their corporate DNA. I think it's important that we all make this something as our day-to-day work in order to achieve what we want to do with patients. And at the end of the day, how do we want to develop drugs much more faster and more effective in order to get more value to patients in a faster time frame.
Christian, let's look at the UK specifically. What impact do you see Brexit having on this effort? And could the current political uncertainty in the UK have a negative impact?
I think, firstly, what we need to see is that the UK remains a very important factor of the global life science industry. So, this pool of talent and these centers of gravity around London, around Cambridge, about other areas in the UK, so this won't go away that fast. And this is what we need to make sure that this continues to be part of the global industry. But I'm more positive than others, when I take a look at the future of the life science industry in the UK. There are areas where we need to be a bit more careful of what's happening right now. So what we see right now is the move of the European Medical Agency from London to Amsterdam. There are talented people who are impacted on this. Do they remain to be part of the EMA? Are they having a different job later on? Are we losing talent and skills within the UK? So that's something where I'm a bit more concerned, and that's something where we all need to be careful. And also, finally, from a pure regulatory standpoint, how is the interaction between the EMA and other local authorities against the MHRA, so the local UK organization? How does this play in the near future? Do pharma companies do need to submit twice in Europe? Is there something where it's a more formal collaboration? So this is all not set in stone yet, and that's something where we as an industry need to be very, very open and transparent towards the people who are actually negotiating Brexit, that this is something which is absolutely essential in order to not disrupting what we are currently doing, because actually a patient doesn't care about Brexit, a patient doesn't care about any macroeconomic changes which are going on right now. The patient wants to have his drug at his disposal at a very early time frame, and he don't want to wait just because Brexit is disrupting certain areas of what we are doing.
And I can't comment on Brexit. I'm not an expert on Brexit, but what I can reinforce is your comment is that we have committed partners on both ends. I think all of the regulatory agencies in the UK and Europe, all of our partners in, specifically in the UK, the NHS, have been extraordinary advocates of making sure that A, this isn't disruptive, and B, that we continue to actually be thought leaders around advancing life sciences and bringing the best drugs to market. And that's where the focus should continue to be.
We've certainly established that we're seeing a trend across the industry where organisations are slowly adopting a patient-centric approach. But Jeremy, have you got any use cases or examples of the true benefits of becoming more patient-centric within your clinical trials?
Absolutely. So we've been doing, patient centricity has not been new or is not new to Novartis. We've been advocating for patient-centric changes to how we run clinical trials for years. And we've done that in different ways. We started looking at our clinical trial design, and part of our process as we look at the protocol drafting process, is we look at every aspect and we diligently ask ourselves, do we need that visit? Do we need that lab test? Do we need that blood test? And we try to make sure that we're asking that in the context of the patient's perspective. We do as much as we can as well to think about patient journeys, right? To understand what's important to the patient. Do we understand the disease from the patient's perspective? And we try to incorporate that into our trial design, into the endpoints that we're selecting, but also into the design itself. Again, thinking about how difficult is it for that patient to do the things that we're going to be asking them to do. We do think increasingly around some of the other areas that we've talked about. Can we introduce technology to more passively collect data, to allow them to avoid a particular visit to a site using a connected sensor, sending a nurse to the patient's home to collect that blood test on a weekend or at a night or early in the morning so as not to disrupt that patient's life. And so those are some things that we've absolutely initiated, and we see the benefits. We see those benefits in the context of the reactions we get from patients, the retention in our clinical trial studies, and improvements in quality data. And we've done a lot of work in trying to evaluate lots of different modalities, and I would say we're deeply committed, and at the same time we're early.
How important do you see new technologies such as artificial intelligence or machine learning or the Internet of Things being in creating a patient-centric future?
I don't want to get caught in, and certainly within the pharma industry, of trying to do things because I'm trying to checkbox an innovation checkbox. I want to do it because it adds value to the patients, it adds value to our objectives as a company to get these important life-saving drugs to market.
I think our job as a technology provider is really to start helping you improve the quality of data that is captured during a clinical trial process. I think that's something where we can do a lot, and partly you can do this with technology. There are other areas where you can do better, but this is our job from Medidata side, and there are certain ways how we can achieve this. You can help pharma companies or biotech companies, to do some auto-coding, where you're using artificial intelligence and machine learning, to get rid of this very lengthy and manual coding process. You can help clients by setting up virtual trials in order to help clients to be more connected to their trial and to their physician, and they don't have to come to the hospital all the time. You can loop in mobile technologies in order to capture the data in a different way. But this is all done because you want to improve the quality of the data, not because of the technology is cool. And I think that's something which is important. Sometimes you are doing innovation because it looks good, but at the end of the day, it needs to be part of a more effective and a more data quality driven approach in order to avoid mistakes that your regulator is sending you back to do some extra work. And there are clients who are using, for instance, trial assurance processes, where we are making use of artificial intelligence by early enough looking into potential mistakes that could have been done over the process of the trial. And that's something that we can avoid at a very early stage in order to be companies like Novartis, be more successful and more effective, go to the regulator and get your approval in a properly defined time frame.
We've had a great discussion around what needs to be done in order to drive patient centricity. So to finish, Jeremy, let me ask you, what does a patient-centric clinical trial of the future look like to you?
So a patient-centric trial of the future, to me, resembles, I'm sitting at home and I could schedule that clinical trial visit around my schedule. It may be in the morning, it may be in the weekend, it may be in the evening. Those clinical trial visits come to my house as opposed to me having to travel somewhere. When I'm introduced to the clinical trial study, I'm introduced to it in a modality that helps me learn, helps me understand, where as if I have a visit that's coming up a couple of days before, maybe the morning of, I get a little short video that explains to me, what does it mean? Why am I doing this? What is the importance of this? So that I'm learning at the same time as I'm giving.
And I agree. And I think we will also see that patients will be much more engaged, much more involved with all the areas that we have discussed. We will also see, and this is what I observe when I'm talking to clients, that we are also at a very early stage looking at the respective market on how and where you want to market the drug that you guys are developing right now. I think this is something which will have an impact on how you're setting up your R&D projects. And I think finally we will see more and more international or global trials, which will require a huge amount of collaboration. So there will be various pharma companies, various biotech companies, various regulators who are engaged, and orchestrating all of them and organizing all these different stakeholders will be a massive amount of work. But I think that's the future, because there will be areas where we are just be able to act as a team globally in order to be successful and to generate value to patients.
Thank you to Christian and Jeremy for coming in today. What's really stood out in this conversation is that patients are no longer a subject. Right from the beginning, trials need to be created around the convenience and comfort of patients. We also need to ensure that the teams responsible for patient centricity are properly funded and supported across the organisation.